The New Testament reading is from Hebrews chapter 1, 1 through 4, and chapter 2, verses 5 through 12. This is in the New Testament on page 218 in the Pew Bible. Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by a Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also created the worlds. He is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being, and he sustains all things by his powerful word. When he had made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Now God did not subject the coming world, about which we are speaking, to angels, but someone has testified somewhere, "What are human beings that you are mindful of them, or mortals that you care for them? You have made them for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned them with glory and honor, subjecting all things under their feet." Now, in subjecting all things to them, God left nothing outside their control. As it is, we do not yet see everything in subjection to them, but we do see Jesus, who for a little while was made lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. It was fitting that God, for whom and through whom all things exist, in bringing many children to glory, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For the one who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one Father. For this reason, Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters, saying, "I will proclaim your name to my brothers and sisters. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. How many of us have something in our homes that we inherited from our family? A number of us do. Many, probably if not most of us, have something like that, especially we who have grown a little older. Why is that? Because if we think about it, almost every time we gain one of these precious personal treasures, it is because of a loss that we have experienced. Out of that loss comes something precious that usually reminds us, hopefully, not of the sorrow of the loss, but the joy of the memory. When I was growing up in North Carolina, we used to make a visit just about every weekend to my father's family home in Lincolnton. It was an old, rambling, and ramshackle farmhouse in which my grandmother lived. Since Dad had 11 brothers and sisters, many of my relatives would gather at the house, and we would share what was truly a lively meal around my grandmother's large, round dinner table, which was covered with this vinyl table covering, which had seen its best days. And I always wondered, what's underneath this? What does it look like underneath this? I always wondered that. When my grandmother died, my father asked his siblings for that old dinner table, which they gladly gave to him. Dad took the table and had it stripped and refinished. To our amazement, what emerged was a beautiful piece of furniture made of old-growth Carolina oak. For the remainder of my years at our house, we ate from that, now proudly revealed table in our dining room, which I know meant more to my father and mother than anything else that they owned. When my sisters moved, Mom and Dad, to a more manageable apartment about 5 years ago, my younger sister asked them for the table, and all of us were glad when she was able to take it and put it in her beautiful house. In our home, here in Oro Valley, Amy and I have her family's dining table, given to us after her mother's death. And though it's a pretty big one, we use it only at holidays. It means a lot to us, and I know to Amy, just to have it there. Families come in many shapes, in many sizes, and many forms. But the one thing they share are the emotional connections of our most intimate relationships. There are other groups that do not reflect that intimacy, but still use that word, family, to describe some type of connection. Have you ever heard the term before, the family of man? It is a phrase that has been used as a title of books and songs and artistic endeavors, such as Edward Steichen's famous photography exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in 1955. The more modern and less gender-centered term we use today, in most cases, is humanity, which probably makes more sense than the kind of emotional connection implied by the term family in the phrase family of man. I would hardly describe the global population in terms of our emotional connection to each other as being a family. At least we hardly show it. Have you ever heard the phrase, the family of God? Now, what could that possibly mean? At first blush, it would imply some religious connection. And that is how the term is loosely used. For example, the church can be called the family of God. Growing up in the South, I often heard the words, the church family. The church family. You probably have too. It's not just a Southern thing. That was the way of describing a particular congregation. We invite you to our church family this Sunday. Yet, in all those years, I never heard or read a more specific definition of that term, church family, beyond the idea of congregation. From the very beginning of the book of Hebrews, the preacher, possibly Paul or one of his close associates, attempts to help us understand the definition of God's family through the history of God's people. The preacher begins with the idea of ancestors and their relationship to God. But who are these ancestors of which the writer of Hebrews speaks? Is the preacher talking about the Jews or the ancient nation of Israel? Is Hebrews talking about all of our ancestors, humanity from its creation? The word prophets provide us the answer to those questions, because the nature of prophecy was not bound to any religious or national concept. The prophets were spiritually inspired to speak the authentic words of God to the world, to humanity, but particularly among humanity, those whose belief made them not just able to hear the prophets, but understand what God was saying through the prophets. Yet the author of Hebrews knows how the prophets were received and how they were accepted. The prophets were received and accepted in ancient Israel as much as they reinforced Israel's relationship with God as defined through the law, the nation, and the temple-centered religion. If the prophets went anywhere outside the lines of that, outside those boundaries, as they always did because they're prophets, right? They were rejected, oppressed, ignored, or simply murdered. But Hebrews presents us with a persistent God who reminds us that there was a point to everything God's prophets were saying. And in Hebrews, the writer reveals that point. That point was God's Son, the one through whom God has spoken to us, according to Hebrews, in these last days. What does that phrase mean? In these last days. Thinking of the time in which Hebrews was written, which is a little bit later in the life of the early church, the last days might mean the return of Jesus Christ to save God's people. That would be a comforting interpretation for those Christians who were suffering persecution, suffering greatly at that time. But here we are, 2,000 years later, still waiting for Christ's return. So could the last days possibly mean something else? The writer is explicit in answering that for us. The prophets are presented as the forebearers of the Son, who is God's final word to the people of God and to all humanity for all time. The time of the Son's return is irrelevant. What matters is that God has spoken in a final and in a definitive way through God's Son, creating a new understanding of the family of God. No longer a religious family. It is now something much more connected, much more intimate. Why did God do this? Why? Why did God speak to us through a Son, appointed heir of all things, through whom God also created the world? I found a humorous answer in a quote from Stephen Colbert's book, I Am America and So Can You. And this is the quote. And remember, Stephen Colbert is not only a committed Christian, he's a good theologian. He understands theology. This is what he wrote. A father has to be a provider, a teacher, a role model, but most importantly, a distant authority figure who can never be pleased. Otherwise, how will children understand the concept of God? The idea of God as a distant authority figure did not emerge from God's relationship with humanity, but from our estrangement from that relationship, beginning with Adam. The allegory of Adam and Eve is about our rejection of God's love, which came to define the reality of all creation. The only relationship that defined humanity was that we shared creation and the suffering that went with it. And that was the extent of our relationship with each other. Sometimes we received the suffering. Sometimes we created the suffering. But we shared this suffering world, suffering together. Hebrews tells us that God changed all of this when God sent the Son, who created a relationship with us that was so deep and so intimate, it superseded any other for all time. That is why this table around which we gather this morning is a family table, which offers a perfect food provided by our perfect God and shared with our perfect brother, Jesus Christ. At Adam's table, we were a family connected by creation, but lost and disaffected by our own fallenness and the rejection of God's intent in creating us. At Abraham's table, we were a family connected by the law. The law was given to us by God as a pathway to a spiritual relationship with God. But religion and sin put an impenetrable stumbling block in that pathway, despite the efforts of the prophets. In response, God was going to have the final word. God always does have the final word. God sent God's Son, Jesus, as our Messiah, and God's final answer to the meaning of the word family. At Christ's table, we discover our one true parent through our one true brother who shared our suffering and went beyond it in his sacrifice upon the cross. And he became not the obstruction of the pathway to God, but the cornerstone upon which the foundation of God's church was built. In his resurrection, Jesus became the only spiritual way to the heart of God. There are many ways to God. Jesus is the spiritual way to God's heart, changing both our existence and our reality. Archbishop Desmond Tutu eloquently describes our new spiritual family with these words, and you've probably heard them before because I've used them in this pulpit before. Here's what he wrote. We are made for goodness. We are made for love. We are made for friendliness. We are made for togetherness. We are made for all of the beautiful things that you and I know. We are made to tell the world that there are no outsiders. All are welcome, black and white and red and yellow, rich and poor, educated and not educated, male, female, gay, straight, all. We all belong to this family, this human family, God's family. Unquote. Without the love of our eternal brother, who has made us all siblings, Tutu's words could have never been spoken. We could have never had that perspective. It is at our brother Christ's table, provided to us by our Heavenly Father, that we gather this morning. Siblings, bound by love, into an eternal family of purpose and hope. This is the table that we inherit and around which we gather, not just this morning, but for all eternity. It is our most precious possession. It is our treasure. So with our siblings all over the world on this World Communion Sunday, let us approach this table with great, great joy and thanksgiving.